Hey, this is Robert Hocking for the Big Blue Button team. We recently hosted our very first global conference, where over 4 days we welcomed a range of speakers and discussions focused on the world of virtual learning and everything about Big Blue Button, the world's classroom. The video I'm about to share is a more in-depth discussion with one of our keynote speakers, Scott McLeod. Scott is an associate professor of educational leadership at the University of Colorado, Denver. In this video interview, you'll discover more about Scott's 4 Shifts protocol, a framework for embracing and incorporating technology into the learning environment, how teachers and families are using technology, about how technology can serve different learners, and about how teachers and parents can get on board with technology and creative learning. We hope you enjoy the interview. Please follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook. We'd love to hear from you.
Scott's an associate professor of educational leadership at the University of Colorado, Denver. He's also a founding director of the UCEA Center for the Advanced Study of Technology, Leadership, and Education, and is also the co-creator of the video series Did You Know? Shift Happens, and the blog Dangerously Irrelevant. Scott, thank you again so much for joining us. The feedback on your keynote presentation was phenomenal. And what I love about this discussion is that you are unabashedly pro learning and education coming together more profoundly in a more advanced way to deepen the learning and engagement students have. So I'm going to start. Would you mind telling us a little bit about your background and how specifically your background led to focusing on the role of technology in supporting deeper learning?
Sure, absolutely. So I was a doctoral student in school leadership. I'm a professor now, preparing school principals and superintendents, teaching those courses if a teacher wants to be a school principal, for example. But back when I was getting my own degree, I had a chance to create and run my department's first computer lab. And what they would do is they would bring me databases and software programs and, different web technologies and basically say, Scott, please learn how to use these and then teach the rest of us faculty and graduate students how to use them. So I basically had 5 years of 20 hours a week of just playing with technology. So then when I emerged from that and graduated and became a professor myself, I realized very quickly that nobody was living at the intersection of technology and leadership. We had a lot of people around the country that were focused on the intersection of technology and teaching, right? We have pre-service teachers and in-service teachers who need to learn how to use technology effectively with students in their classrooms. But nobody was really focusing on the leadership behaviors and support structures that were necessary to support, the teachers and students and to do excellent work in that area. So that's sort of the space that I've decided to live in back in the day, a couple decades ago. And my center, Castle, which is the only center in the United States that's focused on the intersections of leadership and technology and innovation and so on, is really the vehicle through which I do that work. And I get to work with schools all around the world on sort of how do we use technology in more robust ways for learning and teaching.
Wow, this past 15 months then must have been a very, very rich period for you to cultivate those relationships, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's been wild.
I can imagine. I know that you're also the co-director or developer of a program called the 4 Shifts Protocol, which deals with how educators and schools need to integrate education more deeply in a more integrated fashion into the learning model, teaching model. So can you tell us a bit about the 4 Shifts protocol?
Yes, absolutely. So I was in Iowa at the time, working at Iowa State University, and Iowa was on the cusp of what became our country's largest grassroots one-to-one computing movement. And the idea here was that these small rural districts in Iowa decided to invest in some digital equity and devices for students. And so one after another, the districts started going one-to-one and giving every kid a laptop, iPad, full-blown computer, whatever. And so those numbers went from 6 districts in Iowa to 220 plus school districts in Iowa in half a decade. It was this wild ride, like the numbers were doubling every year. And what we found very quickly was it was very easy, of course, to purchase the devices and invest in some bandwidth upgrades, but then they didn't know what to do with the devices. And so they couldn't answer the question, technology for the purpose of what, because they had never really answered that satisfactorily for themselves, other than they just thought kids should have computers in the digital age. So the 4 Shifts protocol emerged from that. My colleague Julie and I got together and said, what kind of dialogue instrument and protocol could we create that allowed teachers and instructional coaches and principals in Iowa to have different conversations about technology and really use it in meaningful ways? And that's where the protocol came from. So the protocol focuses on four big areas: deeper learning, student agency, authentic work, and rich tech infusion. And then within each section, there's a variety of questions and protocol items to consider. And basically what we're trying to do is we're basically trying to elevate technology usage from an efficiency tool to a really powerful and meaningful learning tool. And so, let's don't just use technology in replicative ways where kids are still doing factual recall and procedural regurgitation. And instead of submitting it on a paper worksheet, you submit it in Google Classroom or Schoology or whatever, right? Like, let's actually use technology to help kids get connected to other students and outside experts around the world to help them do meaningful real world work in their local communities, to create and to do, sort of powerful things.
This was the thing that really struck me from the Big Blue Button conference, was this idea that, obviously, uh, kids were forced overnight to go into a virtual classroom, and of course teachers were not necessarily prepared. Like, it wasn't a progressive thing, and they suddenly found themselves in front of a camera having to teach. But what really struck me was that the potential of technology requires us to fundamentally think differently about the way that we deliver content. And someone in the Big Blue Button conference brought, and forgive me, it might have been you actually, Scott, talked about the idea of using or creating a green screen and thinking about it that way. How can you use the power of television, or certainly what we've learned from TV and movies? How can we use the power of that to engage students differently? And I thought I was really fascinated by that shift of think about the power of the technology to enhance the point you're trying to get across, rather than seeing it as just an interface. I was really interested in that point, and I'm curious: is that how well understood is that idea with teachers?
Um, I don't think we're there yet. And, that's a sad thing to say. I've been at this a long time. And to be honest, we've had personal computers in schools for 40 years now. And we still haven't wrapped our head around that idea that technology should be more than sort of an add on in most classrooms. Those tech savvy educators who really get it, they understand the power and potential of what students can do with tech. But I think your average teacher still isn't that technology fluent, to be honest, despite their university courses and despite their trainings in their district. They still haven't quite made the shift. And I think part of the reason is because although the technologies have changed substantially, we can do all kinds of interesting things with tech now that we couldn't do before. The teaching model has not changed substantially, right? I think most educators still think their job is to foster what I call a transmission regurgitation model of education, right? So we're going to transmit some information to you that might come from the teacher or from the textbook or from a video I see online or whatever. And then your job is to regurgitate it back to me, right? You're going to give me a worksheet. You're going to fill out a Google form. You're going to, do some practice problems, whatever. And if you regurgitate well enough, then you're going to get good grades and we're going to send you off to university. And so the sort of like high levels of student agency that are possible with technology, where they can drive their own learning in some interesting and unexpected and maybe unbounded ways. The idea that kids can use technology to create and make and produce and share and connect and collaborate. Like, that's not baked into the learning teaching model in most schools. And so then we then put technology in front of teachers. They use it to foster the learning teaching model that they have in place, right? So if the basic teaching model is regurgitation transmission, they use technology for that, right? And then it's only in a few schools where the learning teaching model is different, where we really see technology flourishing outside a few isolated, pockets of innovation where we have a few teachers who are bound and determined to do something different anyway.
I'm curious about as well. I was just thinking as you're responding to that, as a parent of three kids, I know that if it was up to my wife, our kids would only be playing on wooden toys. It took a lot for me to convince my wife that our kids should have some access to technology. And I'm curious about, I know my wife is not alone in this respect. I think there's a lot of negative associations with certain parents around kids being glued to a screen. And I'm wondering as well, like, is there reticence or resistance from parents to wanting to have their kids use technology more effectively to learn? Do they see it as almost the great kids away from? And does that present a challenge for trying to get this movement started?
Yeah, yes, and we're evolving new modalities of being, and technology is affecting all of us in different ways in our personal, professional, educator lives, whatever. And everybody has their own different balance, right? Like your family's balance might be different than my family's balance, and so on. But what I always encourage parents to think about is to look at how kids are using the technology, not just that they're using the technology. So, I too don't want my kids glued to a screen passively, and just consuming stuff hour after hour after hour in sort of this, glazed eyes, modality.
Mm,
But I love it when my kids use technology to make things, to create things, and so on, right? So when my youngest child will spend 3 days creating this highly complex, interactive Minecraft world, right, that he and his buddies can then do various things in. And as part of that world, he's also learning some fairly sophisticated coding techniques, right? Like, I love it when he uses technology in that way, right? And that feels very different to me than I just spent 3 days watching YouTube videos and zoning out on the couch.
right. Thank you for giving insight into my life in that last statement, Scott. But no, but that's a great observation, actually, and a really interesting answer. So I want to go back to the four shifts protocol for a moment.
Sure.
In your description, you describe that the importance of starting with the question, technology at the service of what?
Right.
When I read that a couple of times, I was curious. So, what should the answer be?
Well, for me, I'm on a mission to make school less boring. I'm tired of walking into school buildings or, virtual classrooms and seeing kids just zoned out, bored out of their mind. They could care less about the learning material and what they're supposed to be doing in class because it has no meaning or relevance to them, right? And I think we have lots of data, and both anecdotally and from research studies, that show that kids are incredibly disconnected and are really struggling to find meaning in the learning tasks that we put before them most school days. Um, so, because technology is a liberating force in many ways, it's an empowering force if we let kids do so. Then for me, technology is an essential lever for empowering children to experience a different kind of learning, right? And I think the example I just gave is a great one, right? We can have students use technology to consume information, right? So you as a teacher are giving a lecture and they're sitting there watching you, or you assigned a YouTube video or whatever. We can have students use technology to increase organizational efficiency. You used to turn in the paper worksheet, now you submit it through some online learning management system. Or we can use technology to empower kids to do really interesting, cool work, like creating your own Minecraft world and learning coding,
Hmm.
or starting your own charity, or connecting with other kids and adults around the world who are passionate about the same social causes that you are, and so on, right? We can use technology to have you work on real world projects in your local community or global community and actually make an impact on the world around you. Um, and so, it all depends on the lenses through which we view the technology. So for me, those four shifts of deeper learning, let's get far beyond just factual recall and procedural regurgitation. Let's let the kids drive their own learning in ways that are really interesting. That's the student agency piece. Let's make it more real world and authentic so they find the connections with the world around them rather than these sort of isolated, disconnected schoolwork that they usually do. And then use technology as a powerful lever to help them connect and collaborate and share with others. And when you put those four together, you've got this really interesting stew where kids are doing very different work than they traditionally have done.
I something you said just triggered something. I've been a teacher for a number of years now, and I remember once teaching a business course at a high school level. I taught in a what would be considered a quite affluent school. I taught in what would be considered a less affluent school or a poor school. And I remember I was fascinated by the difference in the approach of the students. So the students that were coming from the affluent school, which were typically the students of, or the children of lawyers,
Hmm.
doctors, etc.,
Sure.
they were incredibly well prepared for the traditional learning environment. They were disciplined.
Hmm.
And I'm making an assumption here, but I was just witnessing groups of students that seemed to understand how it worked and were ready to participate in that kind of quite classic learning environment. With the kids in the other school, what fascinated me was that they were not well prepared. These were not kids seemingly that were used to sitting down and focusing on a textbook and, doing a bunch of reading, but they were great lateral thinkers. And I'm just wondering if you feel, maybe you don't, but I'm just curious if you feel that is there a type of student that this potential on than others?
Yeah, so in every school, there are students who are really good at playing the game of school, right? They slide right into those control and compliance environments that we have. They do what the teacher tells them. They get rewarded behaviorally. They get rewarded academically, right? I have two children who are just like that, and they just marched through school and got good grades, and you know, never caused any fuss, and it was awesome. And they fit very neatly into the traditional model of school. And then we have this other group of students who really struggles with, the fact that they never get to pick what they learn or how they learn it. They don't care about half of what we're putting in front of them because they can't find any meaning or relevance in it. And then that starts to show up in behavioral pushback, academic pushback, and so on. And that's my third kid, right? Who shows up every day and is like, this game of school is something that I don't want to play. I don't find any meaning in it. I really need something different, right? And
Mm.
so, and we have always struggled with that second group of students, the ones who don't want to just sit quietly and passively and listen to the teacher and read the textbook and regurgitate. They want to do things that are hands-on, that are active, that are interactive. They want to make and create. They want to feel like they're doing something meaningful and relevant, not just answering 25 practice problems because the teacher told me, right? And we've never done a great job of serving those students. We usually just tell them, see you later, or you're going to get bad grades, or good luck with life, or whatever. But and again, if we view technology as a liberating force, in this fact that um, technology can be a very powerful lever to individualize and personalize students' learning, right? Now we can create different pathways for different groups of kids. And I think that's what we're seeing in these what are called deeper learning schools that are focused a lot on inquiry and project-based learning rather than recall and regurgitation, right? Is that technology is used in very different ways in those schools. So in a more traditional school, students are using technology mostly to just give back what the teacher asks of them. But over here in these deeper learning schools, kids are using technology to work on real world projects. They're working with external partners. They're using technology in very authentic real world ways, like we do, after you graduate high school and university. Um, they're making things and creating things. They're using it to collaborate and communicate and so on. And so, again, because the learning teaching paradigm is different in the two schools, the technology usage is different as well. And what we find in these other schools is that we're reclaiming a lot of kids who were unsuccessful in the traditional model because now they get to do something different. And so it's not that they needed more of the same or that they weren't capable. Like you said, they might be fantastic lateral thinkers, they might be divergent thinkers more than convergent thinkers, whatever, but they have a space to be the kind of learner that they need to be, and they get to use technology in very different ways, and it's very, very powerful. And we reclaim them and get them back on pathways to life success.
That is an amazing example, actually, what you described there. I totally, totally see it. I interviewed a team from an organization in London called Community Music.
Hmm.
And this organization is 30 years old. They deal with kids that have been basically kicked out of schools and are not allowed back.
Okay.
These are teens. And community music actually is all about using music as a way to engage them. And often these kids are coming in, they're members of gangs, they come in quite hostile because their entire academic experience traditionally has not been a positive one. And
Sure.
one of the very first thing that they do is it is the mandate coming out of the first session is they have to have created a piece of music. And
Nice.
what's really interesting is they said the change that you witness over the course of one session And at the end of the session, it's often the first time they've ever created anything. And
Hmm.
what's fascinating is they're using technology and they're using the medium of music, which they can relate to,
Right.
as a way to basically to rediscover the possibility of education. I thought, God, that was an eye opener. So fascinating.
Right,
Again,
but what you've articulated there is an environment of empowerment and control and autonomy and choice in a way that they didn't have in the other settings where they were labeled as insufficient and incapable.
yes, exactly right. Really, really interesting. But you know, it really does. You know, teachers and parents don't have the opportunity of having a chat with a guy like you, as I am right
Right.
now. You know, it's hard for me because I'm interviewing you formally, but I'm also a parent thinking, what does this mean for me?
Right,
But
right, right.
it really is interesting because as we talk, one gets a greater sense that we are literally at the beginning. Really have we are thinking about what's possible. You know, it's insane in a way when you think that as adults we know that the device, the internet, has opened up the world to us, has opened up and presented opportunities for knowledge that we would never have conceived of when we were younger, growing up, going to the library. You know, and it
Right.
really is amazing now. And this is represents technology represents a step change in all the ways that you can deliver information and engage students, as you say. It's tough though. Like, what's the challenge of what are the challenge? So what you just said to me makes total sense. So what is the biggest challenge in getting schools, teachers, and parents on side with this
Mhm.
and getting them excited by the potential of this?
Right. So I think the biggest barrier to changing school is not resources or time or any of the other things that people usually bring up. Lack of devices. It's actually our deeply embedded mindsets of what school should look like. You can go to most people on the street and say the word school to them, and a whole host of images immediately come to mind. Kids are sitting in rows. There's a teacher up at the front. The teacher is presenting information. The kids are sitting passively. The day is divided up into blocks of time. Maybe the bell even rings. Kids shuffle to the next space. Here's how school calendars work, and those images and ways of being in school are so deeply embedded that when you present something different, like the community music program that you're talking about, people have a real hard time wrapping their head around it, right? So you can go to parents and you can say, look, we've got all kinds of options we could do with children. Here's the traditional one. You go to a 7-period secondary school day, right? And you march from subject to subject. None of the subjects are connected together. There's a little bit of technology use, just like, for seasoning. And basically, they're going to do low level knowledge work. They're going to spit it back to you, and they're going to get good grades. And that's how you know they're ready for university, right? Like that's model one. That's the traditional model. That's the one we're all familiar with and experienced. Over here, we have these other school models where kids are like out in the community. They're working on projects. They're making things. They're connecting with outside experts. They're using technology to make their own music or code their own apps or whatever. And we don't have bell schedules. We don't have the school calendar looks different. Kids spend half their day outside the building, whatever, right? And parents are like, wow, that sounds a little bit interesting, but also kind of weird. And I'm hesitant. And I think what we have to help parents and families, communities, and educators see is the power of those newer models, right? Because the learning work that those kids do in those second spaces are very, very different, right? Um, but if we can get some exposure to educators, a lot of them will see the power of those, right? They will walk in and say, wow, these kids are doing some really interesting, meaningful work. Check it out. This community music program has re engaged kids in ways that our model was failing them, right? And we want that to happen, of course. We want our children to be successful in life and find avenues where they can feel empowered and liberated and capable. And so maybe we should have more of that, right? And then the conversation begins around how do we start creating more spaces that go beyond the traditional model and create some other pathways and choice options for kids, right? And I think the bottom line for me is that for too long, school has been a one size fits all model. And if you don't fit into it, then you're labeled a failure. And what we know, of course, is that we have a diversity of humanity streaming through our school doors every day. And whenever the diversity of humanity meets a one-size-fits-all model, it's always doomed to fail. And so the question is for us as communities and schools is, do we care about the 20, 30, 40, 50% of kids who struggle under the one size fits all model? And are we willing to create structures where they also can be successful, or are we just going to write them off?
Well, and I want to circle back on this point. Is I have my middle child is developmentally delayed.
Okay.
I've been a teaching fellow at Oxford University, and the number of people that I know who are terrified because their kids are struggling in school, and they have this drive to get into an elite school like in Oxford or wherever. It often without any clear reason as to why they're driven to have them go to these places.
Right.
The reality is that, what I'm really struck by is the number of people who know their kids are struggling would not need a lot of convincing that what you're talking about would change them fundamentally. So,
Yep.
Where's the resistance coming from?
Right. Well, a lot of the resistance comes from the families whose kids are successful in the traditional model and don't want you to mess it up. Right. So, one of the things that's been interesting to observe is that if you take a traditional school and you create some kind of project-based learning experience, for instance, that the students who struggle the most are the ones who are really good at playing the traditional game of school, right? And so all of a sudden, here are children who have been socialized into the just tell me what to do environment and have gotten very good at that. Whatever the teacher asks, I'll give it back to her and I'll get good grades. And now all of a sudden, they're being asked to think for themselves for the very first time. They're asked to make decisions about their own work for the very first time in like 10 years, right? Because they've been socialized and they're completely unmoored. They have absolutely no, it creates anxiety. They don't know how to operate. They beg the teacher to just tell them what to do. And the teacher's like, it's an inquiry project. You decide, right? So those families push back because now you're messing up the model. And you're causing my kid anxiety. And those are the families that have the highest social capital in the community. And so, when we're experimenting with these new modalities of learning and we're trying to reclaim some kids who are disengaged, we often have to start with the kids who aren't successful because they've got nothing to lose, right? Like my kid over here, like you said, is already struggling. We're desperate for something different. The school is offering something different. Let's try that, right? But the families who are already successful, they don't want anybody messing up the track. And now you're causing anxiety.
And what's really interesting about that exact point is, the area that I teach in is in business. And what's fascinating is that you need to be effective, particularly in the area of entrepreneurship. You need great lateral thinking skills.
Right.
And, I would imagine for those kids that are playing the professional school, they actually may find whole new levels of competition out there because they are taught to think a certain way, and they're going to be challenged in this more dynamic, multi-dimensional lateral thinking environment that you're describing. I think they, to a certain extent, I think they might have legitimate reasons for concern.
Probably so. Yeah, because the world doesn't really favor regurgitators. Academic environments favor regurgitators, but real world environments don't. And I think, we can help people see what this looks like in transition, right? So you mentioned business. So I remember a conversation I had with a teacher who taught marketing at a secondary school. And she was talking about how she loved her marketing students and they were, marching through the textbook, blah, blah, blah. And I said, and I just asked a question. I said, are there very small businesses around your community that could use some help with marketing? And she was like, yes, probably. And I said, well, why don't you have your kids do marketing, not just read about marketing? And it was like this little light bulb went on in her head. She was like, oh, okay, right? Because ultimately the goal is that kids learn how to do marketing, not just read about it, right? But she had never made that mental shift. But, if she then went back and started tapping the power of her kids' knowledge about marketing to benefit some small business in the community that didn't have any resources, right? Or nonprofits or charitable foundation, whatever, right? Like that's a win-win on both sides. And I think that's the kind of mental shift that we can help people make. And they can see the value in that, right? They can see the value in not just reading about something, but actually doing something.
Yeah, that's a great point. So my last question is, so if someone that's watching this is a parent or an educator or a principal, what are some of the great examples that they could look to some of the
Okay. So I'm actually gonna give a shout out to my new book that comes out next week. It's called Leadership for Deeper Learning. What we did was we identified 30 schools around the world that are doing some really interesting stuff with kids.
wow.
Um, these are very liberating spaces for students. They're very empowering spaces. They're doing some amazing learning work, both in school and out of school in their community. And then what we did was we interviewed all the principals, and then we did site visits for 28 of the 30 schools before the pandemic hit. So the book describes in detail the kind of learning that students are doing in these spaces and the kind of teaching that's happening, and then also the leadership behaviors and support structures that go into making that work. So it's basically a book of 30 examples of really cool learning environments around the world. And there's a few other books out there that are kind of like that. The Getting Smart website often profiles really innovative schools from around the world who are doing cool stuff. And so again, on my quest to get examples in front of people, my new book, Leadership for Deeper Learning, could be one way to do that. The Getting Smart website is another. But in almost every locality, we have schools that are doing things differently. So I think if you start sort of sniffing around your local city or province or region of the state or whatever, you will find schools that are doing inquiry-based work and project-based work with kids, and they're definitely worth a visit. And every time I walk away from the schools, I always wish my kid went there, because the stuff that students are doing there is so far beyond the traditional transmit regurgitate model. And it's really exciting to see kids as empowered actors in their own learning and making a difference in the world around them.
Do you know what, Scott? I cannot seriously, man. I cannot thank you enough for this because, as I said, as a parent, it's inspiring to hear that this is happening, and I, for one, will absolutely be buying your book. And
Thanks.
I'm keen to see these models in action. So, thank you so much again, and long may your work continue. Thanks, thanks.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.